Hello and welcome back, future scientists. I'm Mr. K with Mississippi Public Broadcasting. We're going to continue our lecture today talking about evolution on the planet Earth. When I saw y'all last time, we talked about how life formed all of these complex macromolecules and ingredients we needed on the Earth to form life later down the road. Today we're going to talk about some of those earliest organisms that we're aware of that were on our planet. So let's go ahead and get started and see what we're talking about today. So we're going to talk about early life on the planet. Most scientists agree that life most likely got started deep in the oceans near these hydrothermal vents. These hydrothermal vents, they're at the bottom of the ocean. There's these cracks and crevices that lead down deeper into Earth's crust. And so they have a lot of gases coming out of them, but there's also a lot of natural heat coming out of these hydrothermal vents. Here, the heat, chemicals, and water conditions would best facilitate or help the necessary chemical reactions to create the first forms of life. This was the primordial soup that life on Earth sprang from. So this primordial soup, the idea here is that we have all the ingredients necessary for life. We don't have life yet, but it's just a matter of time before these ingredients come together in the right way to form a living organism. And scientists think that this happened deep down in the bottom of the oceans on the planet Earth. So let's talk about some organic evolution that kind of led to this process. Okay, so how do we start with simple cells that lack many of the essential organisms, and how do we start there and then get to where we are today? Well, scientists think that organelles played a very important role in all of this. Scientists think that organelles like mitochondria and chloroplasts used to be free-living bacteria that were then ingested by some amoeba-like cell. The mitochondria and chloroplasts were so good at their job that instead of consuming them, the amoeba and organelle formed a symbiotic relationship. They teamed up and started to help each other out. The cells got free energy and the organelles didn't have to defend themselves. So instead of, when this amoeba found these mitochondria and chloroplasts, instead of just eating them like they would eat most other bacteria, they formed a relationship, a win-win relationship. We know that mitochondria is really, really good at making energy, and chloroplasts are really, really good at making food. Well, the cell was really smart in a certain way of thinking. Instead of just ingesting them, they started to work together. And the mitochondria didn't have to fend off larger amoebas anymore, and the amoeba got free energy out of it. So it was a really good win-win situation. This term, that what's going on here, is known as endosymbiosis, okay? What happens here is when these first amoeba-like cells ingested the chloroplast, they became the first autotrophic organisms. Single-celled organisms were the first forms of life. Autotrophic single-celled organisms performed photosynthesis for about 3.5 billion years. This produced oxygen and oxygenated Earth's atmosphere. Once oxygen was in high abundance on Earth, we started to see the first multicellular organisms about 600 million years ago. Multicellular organisms cannot exist without oxygen to help produce energy. So this term, endosymbiosis, what's going on here is there's a couple of root words we can pick out. Endo means inside. Symbiosis is that win-win relationship. Bio is life. So what's going on here is the amoeba is ingesting these organelles and they're having a win-win relationship. The chloroplast played a very important role because when these single-celled organisms ingested the chloroplast, they became the first autotrophic organisms. And we know that autotrophs play an important role in Earth's atmosphere as well as all of its food chains. So remember, the early Earth didn't have any oxygen. Without any oxygen, we're not going to see big multicellular organisms like animals. We just need too much energy and we can't make enough without oxygen. So for billions of years, these single-celled autotrophs are pumping oxygen into the atmosphere all day long for billions of years. Eventually, there's enough oxygen in the atmosphere to support multicellular organisms, like big animals. When that happens, we get something known as the Cambrian explosion, and we start to see a lot of new types of life. And that all happened about 6 million years ago. I wanted to show you this picture. This is that endosymbiosis that I'm talking about, okay? On the left over here, this is an ancestral host cell. So this is some kind of early amoeba, and it doesn't have these important organelles in there. It doesn't have mitochondria, it doesn't have chloroplast. But through this process, endosymbiosis, instead of eating these, scientists think that the mitochondria and the chloroplast were like early types of bacteria. Instead of just eating the bacteria, they formed this win-win relationship. They teamed up instead. And now today we can find mitochondria and chloroplast in a lot of different types of cells. That relationship was so beneficial that it stuck around and has been successful for millions of years, or even billions of years. Okay, so that leads us to something known as the Phanerozoic eon. So once that autotrophs are pumping all that oxygen into the atmosphere, we hit a limit where there's a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere, and that's really, really important. When that happens, we start something known as the Phanerozoic eon. The Phanerozoic eon is marked by the presence of large multicellular organisms. Phanerozoic literally means visible life. So up until this point, it was hard to see life. There weren't a lot of multicellular organisms. If there were any, they were in the oceans, and there weren't really animals like we think about them today. Once these single-celled bacteria and algae had performed photosynthesis for a couple of billions of years, there was finally enough oxygen in the atmosphere to support large animals. Multicellular organisms, especially animals, need oxygen to survive. So I just wanted to kind of point this out to us real quick so we can kind of see what's going on here. Kind of right here in the middle, this is something known as the Cambrian explosion. And this is very, very important in the study of life on Earth. What happens is, all of a sudden, there are a lot of new forms of life on the planet that there weren't this many types of animals on the planet up until this point. What's happening is everything to the left of this, once the Earth forms and the photosynthesis happens, all of this, the only thing that's happening here is photosynthesis. The single-celled organisms pumping oxygen into the atmosphere. Once we hit about 20% oxygen in the atmosphere, we get the Cambrian explosion. We get a lot of new types of life on the planet. This Cambrian explosion is the beginning of the Phanerozoic eon. Phanerozoic means visible life. So the idea here is now we're seeing a lot of different types of life on the planet, and they're easy to see. They're multicellular animals on land. Also, what's going on? Phanerozoic means visible life, and so what that means to scientists is now we are actually finding fossils in the fossil record. Everything to the left of the Cambrian explosion, this stuff is either too small to see or does not fossilize well. Things like mushrooms and coral reefs and stuff and jellyfish, they don't really leave fossils behind. There's no hard parts to them like bones. So once the Cambrian explosion happens, we enter the Phanerozoic eon, and we're finding a lot of different types of life in the fossil record. You can go and see the life in the fossil record. Okay, so let's keep this going. Okay, so I wanted to talk about the first forms of life. This is the oldest fossils of organisms that we have found on the planet. The earliest life forms we know of were microscopic organisms that left fossil evidence in rocks about 3.5 billion years ago. These early life forms are known as stromatolites. So these stromatolites are blue and green algae. So they're blue-green algae, they're bacteria, so they're photosynthetic, but what they do is they form these large colonies, and they use the rocks that they're around to build their colonies. And so you can actually still find them today, but this is just a fossil of one. But what's really interesting about them, they're photosynthetic. So what happens is when they're underwater, these large rocks will look like they're fizzing, almost like a can of Coke or something. But what's happening is they're doing photosynthesis, and they're releasing oxygen in the form of these little bubbles. And so this is the oldest fossil that we found, 3.5 billion years old. Again, the Earth is only 4.54 billion years old. So these organisms are very, very old. They're the oldest thing that we know about, and they're called stromatolites, and they're a type of photosynthetic bacteria. Okay, the last thing I wanted to talk about today is something known as the tree of life. Technically this is a phylogenetic tree, but we can think of it as the tree of life. And what it does is it shows all the connections of living organisms and how they're related and what their common ancestors are. Just to orient you a little bit, this green area here towards the top, that's something known as archaea. So scientists used to think they were bacteria, but they're a single-celled type of organism that love to live in extreme environments. So if you know like what a geyser is, it's like a really hot water geyser. Think of like Old Faithful in Yellowstone. That water would burn us. We would not be able to survive the sulfur and the hot water there. But these archaea really love to live in those they're called extremophiles. So they live where it's really hot, they live where it's really salty, places where most types of organisms wouldn't survive. These types of organisms are very, very old. And so that's why they like to live in those extreme environments, because that's what it was like on the planet billions of years ago. Okay? This red area up here, these are the eukaryota. So that's animals and plants as well as fungi. Anything with eukaryotic cells would fall in this red area. You can see that the majority of this tree of life is blue. All of this blue is bacteria. So you can see by just looking at this picture that there's way more bacteria than there is anything else. And that makes sense because they're very small, they're hard to see, and they're very, very old. So they reproduce a lot quicker than we do. And because of that, there's a lot of more different types of bacteria. Okay? What's really important though is that you can see all of these lines, if you trace them back far enough, they all meet together in the middle here. And scientists think that this is a hypothetical organism. And the hypothetical organism is called LUCA, L-U-C-A. And that is an abbreviation for Last Universal Common Ancestor. Scientists think that if you go back far enough in the fossil record, or if you go back far enough in the tree of life, you would find an organism that relates all of these different life forms together. And one example or one reason that scientists think that this might be the case is that all of these creatures have some things in common. And one very important thing is that they all use DNA. Every single one of these organisms have DNA in their cells, and that's how they're able to reproduce and pass on their genetic information to the next generation. And so you just have to think about it like this. What is more common, or what is more likely, I should say? What's more likely? That DNA appeared once and that it was very, very successful, and it was so successful that it stuck around in all these different organisms. Is that more likely, or is it more likely that each individual organism on this chart, independently of each other, decided to use DNA to pass on their genetic information? For scientists, they just think it's more likely that DNA arrived once and that it was successful and that it stuck around. So that's a really strong piece of evidence that supports the theory of evolution and that we all have a common ancestor if you go back far enough. So thank you so much for following along with me today. Your teacher has some other work for you to do. Make sure to give that your best effort, and I hope everybody has a great day.